We are continuing our discussion of I'm Judging You, the Do Better Manual by Luvvie Ajayi. This is my little helper, Lolly. I can assure you he read almost the entire book with me, so he is quite the expert. So he may be joining me for part of the conversation. I am now going to turn our attention to the next chapter for discussion today, which is Racism is for Assholes. And I want to talk a little bit. So I did a lot of research and reading of different reviews on I'm Judging You as we were preparing for our discussions today. And I noticed there was a lot of discussion of, on these particular chapters being privilege and racism, this idea that Luvvie wasn't saying anything groundbreaking or earth-shattering, and I think that is really important because we need to have discussions that are more one-on-one. I think we make a mistake of assuming everyone knows the basics, that everyone has had a basic primer in a lot of these issues, and that is just not the case. I know from personal experiences and conversations that I had, I end up getting into quite predicaments by assuming that everyone has a basic understanding of some of these issues. So the conversation I'm about to have is very closely tied to the conversation Brittany hosted at 1:30. So if you didn't get a chance to watch it, I really recommend watching that in conjunction with this video because it is very closely tied. I'm going to try and put Lolly down because he's driving me crazy today. There we go. All right, so I'm going to start with a few questions. And the first question I have starts on page 73, where Luvvie writes, first of all, even nice people can be racists because racism does not depend on malicious intent. So I ask you, what role do you believe intent plays in racism? Can you be a racist if you mean well? Let me give you a hint. The answer is yes. I think we run into this misconception that if you are only racist if you use the N-word, or you are clearly a racist if you hate black people, or we can look at extreme examples of slavery and say that was racism. I don't do that, I wasn't a part of that, so I can't possibly be racist. The problem with that is that we are dismissing so much. It is far too narrow of a definition of racism. So throughout the chapter, Luvvie does something which I think is pretty powerful, and she has these different sections, and I'm going to read you the headlines because I think that they're very poignant. Racism is not always white hoods and burning crosses. Sometimes it's suits and boardrooms. Sometimes it's blue uniforms and black robes. Sometimes it is behind teachers' desks and in principals' offices. It is on anchors' desks and in headlines. It is on Wall Street and on Capitol Hill. And the idea here is that racism shows up through complacency when there is racist activity going on. It shows up through a refusal to acknowledge our privileges and the benefits that we receive from them. Racism comes in the form of operating in and choosing to ignore the existence of systems of oppression. Racism is absolutely that notion of saying it's not seeing color, saying we are post-racist, refusing to acknowledge that it even exists. If you look to page 80, Luvvie writes, racism is the lasting psychological, financial, and cultural legacy of centuries of slavery and segregation brought on black people, on the lack of atonement of white people in power, and that ginormous nerve of telling them to get over it. We do not, as people of privilege, as white people, get to tell people of color to get over it that racism is over. It is not our place or our decision to make such a declaration. And I think that she does such a wonderful job in this chapter, which, to some may seem as the basics. This is not going to be an entire course on racism or racist history, but she draws out what I think are incredibly powerful and important starting points that if you do not understand this, the conversation can't possibly move forward. And so, can you mean well? I hear this all the time from people that I know. Well, I didn't say the N-word, or I'm not talking about those Black people, or I have Black friends, I can't be racist. Well, of course you can participate in racism, you can say racist things, you can do racist things, even if you're a seemingly nice person, or even if you have friends that are Black. That does not change the truth of some of your behavior or systems or stereotypes that you continue to perpetuate. And so recognizing that is the first step in being able to fix it and do something about it and to do better, as Luvvie would say. So the next question that I have, if we can kind of bounce off of that, and I think looking at Brittany's discussion of privilege is incredibly important as you learn to understand just how much more broad the definition of racism is. And you can look at all these different examples, as Luvvie did in her different sections, of racism isn't just white hoods and burning crosses. So my next question is, what is the difference between equality and equity, and why does it matter? So this is this idea, and there's a wonderful infographic that I think is, for those who are more visual, could be very helpful. And I'm sure if you just Googled equality versus equity, it would come up. But basically what it is it shows three people. One person is very tall, one person is sort of medium height, and one person is very short. And they're all trying to see over a fence. And they give, in the first infographic, it says equality. And they give everyone the same size box. And they all get one box and they stand on it. Well, what happens is that the very tall person is still very tall and they can see over the fence clearly still. They could before. The medium height person stands on the single box and they can see over, but they're still medium height. And the short person stands on the same size box and they are still the shortest and cannot see over the fence. So in the second infographic, it says equality, and it is the same three characters, and you have the very tall person and the medium and the short person. The tall person gets no box and they can very clearly see above the fence. The medium height person gets one box and they can see over the fence, and now they are at the same height as the very tall person. And the short person receives two boxes, and now the short person can see over the fence and is now at the same height of everyone else. And so this is the idea between everyone is equal, we treat everyone the same, okay, the same rules for everyone. Equity takes into account what you need to be successful and treats people accordingly. This is so closely tied to the idea of privilege that you cannot possibly understand the difference between equality and equity if you do not understand recognizing privilege and the idea that your privilege gives you certain benefits, whether you ask for them or not. And I know, as Brittany pointed out, there's all different kinds of privilege. There's privilege based on skin color or economic status, or whether you're able-bodied. Like, all of these play a role in understanding why equity is so important. Because if we take into account privilege and the benefits that you receive from privilege, and distribute benefits based on that so that we can all make it to the same level playing field, we're going to be in a much better place. And that, I think, is what we're striving for. And Luvvie has a great way that she describes this that I thought was really, truly simplistic and easy to wrap your head around, because this is a concept that I've discovered in a lot of my conversations that so many people struggle with. And so Luvvie writes, even if today every law was reevaluated fairly, so Black people had the same rights as white folks, and the barriers to access, healthcare, education, politics, and business were removed, we would still not have full equality. It's like removing you from the chains that cuffed you to the pole at the beginning of the race and telling you to catch up with everyone who's been running for, say, centuries already. We're not all Usain Bolt, you know. We need equity, which means taking that lack of a head start into account. Can you give us a pair of rocket shoes so we can catch up? And I think that that's just this great visual. So you say, okay, well, everything's equal now. Now you're allowed to participate in the race, but I've already been running for years, and expecting everyone to be like, well, why haven't you caught up yet? And so we really have to work to understand the effects of racism that are not just today in this moment. They are from centuries of oppression and racist behavior and policies and systems and power to keep people of color in positions without power. And to do that, we have to take into account our privilege and oppression and work for equity. So that is a concept that if you are not comfortable with it, if it seems foreign to you, I urge you to continue to think about it, to continue to read about it, because it is one of the most important hurdles that we can get over. And like I said, it is so intrinsically tied to privilege that you cannot separate the two issues. And if you don't understand one, I don't think that you're going to be able to fully understand the other. So that is something I think it does matter. It's so, so important. So my final question, looking at this chapter, and there is so much good stuff in here. It may be review for some, and it may be completely new topics for others, but I highly recommend reading this chapter. If nothing else, these last two have been the book itself is so funny, and I think she handles these topics in a way that is easy to understand. She doesn't throw in a lot of like activist jargon that can sometimes be confusing, and she uses humor and levity to allow, I think, people to remain open to criticism and more willing to move into uncomfortable spaces, which is, I think, one of the great power of humor, that it can really cause us to like be able to look inward without instantly going into that defensive mode. And so I think she uses that in these chapters so brilliantly. And I'll go to my last question. And it's, why do you think that Luvvie chose to bold the names of certain people she discussed in this chapter? And do you think it was effective? So if you noticed throughout this chapter, Luvvie bolded the names of Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Mike Brown, Trayvon Martin, and Aiyana Stanley Jones. This is the only time she uses bold text throughout the entire book. You'll see her do all caps or italics, but this is the only time. And I think it is so powerful because each one of these individuals was killed at the hands of police officers or our criminal justice system. And I think it is such a reminder of the importance of speaking their names and recognizing the humanity in these people. And if you look on page 79, Luvvie writes, "Black people actually have to prove their humanity instead of having it accepted as given. Even in death, they won't let your soul rest without smearing it in the dirt." So often we see in the reporting of Black people, men and women, who are dying at the hands of police officers in this country, rather than reporting on the victims, we are talking about well, were they criminals, or what did they do? They must have done something, instead of recognizing the absolute tragedy that has occurred. And so I think by her bolding their names and drawing our attention to the humanity of these individuals was just so powerful. And she doesn't talk about it. Luvvie doesn't say, this is why I did it, this is why these names are bolded. But it causes you to stop, and it causes you to think, to remember these individuals. And so I thought, it just was really powerful. She goes on to write in the same section, "Then you want to add insult to injury by telling us to be calm in the face of this violence and degradation. Black trauma is never given space to heal because we have to make sure that white people who hurt us don't feel too bad about it. Even as victims, we're told to care about the feelings of those who harm us. And this is something I've seen so often, and it is heartbreaking and infuriating. We don't want to make white people feel too bad about this, or can't we move on? Can't we get over it? Or, this situation, well, they must have done this wrong. You see it in the way that people talk about Black Lives Matter protests. I think this is something Brittany and I had talked about quite a bit recently. The University of South Carolina's basketball team has done very well in March Madness. I don't do basketball, but it was impossible to not know. There was celebration after they made it into the Final Four, which included like throwing couches out of windows or setting things on fire and blocking traffic. And it was, oh, look at them celebrating. Look how, excited everyone is. Oh, it's a wild party. Where not that long ago, I listened to so many white people say, I don't want these Black Lives Matter protests in the street. They're blocking traffic. This is dangerous. They're destructing property, when people are literally fighting for their human rights, fighting to be heard, fighting for their humanity to be recognized. And in that instance, we're like, can you please just stop inconveniencing all of us so much? And then in the face of a basketball celebration, we're willing to turn a blind eye and just call it a wild party. And I thought that was just so stunning and stark. And I think really brings to light and kind of highlights just this idea that even when people are dying, we're like, but could you please just be a little quieter about it? That is racism. That is one of these huge hurdles that we have not even come close to tackling. So that is my conclusion of my final question. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. If you have not done so, please, please, please read this chapter. It is very powerful. It is a good place to start. Even if you know these things, it could be a great place to start on learning how to talk about them. There's a lot of people that may think this or know it, but it can be difficult to articulate. So take a look, read this, take it to heart. If it makes you uncomfortable, read it again. And the rest of the afternoon is going to be a little bit more lighthearted. Brittany is going to be talking about Facebook and your behavior on social media. She's going to judge us all pretty harshly, and I cannot wait because I love this topic. And then I will be back at 4:30 to talk about how to succeed at business failure and Comic Sans fonts, because I am with Luvvie on this one. Cannot wait to talk to you again later, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.